The world for Alistair Finch was a tapestry woven from sound and texture, a meticulously curated darkness he had inhabited for a decade. Today, the threads were coarse, chaotic. The annual Founders' Day outing was his sister's idea, a necessary evil to maintain the illusion of a philanthropic billionaire engaged with the city his family had practically built. He hated it. The air in the public garden was thick with the cloying sweetness of blooming magnolias, a scent he'd once loved, now just another anchor to a past he couldn't see. The crunch of gravel under his polished Oxfords, the distant clang of a streetcar, the cacophony of 100 conversations. It was a sensory assault. His hand tightened on the smooth, cool metal of his cane, the other resting on the ever-present forearm of Marcus, his head of security. "How much longer, Marcus?" Alistair's voice was a low rasp, unused to the open air. "Beatrice is finishing her speech," Marcus replied, his tone as starched and reliable as his suit. "Another 10 minutes, sir." A child shrieked with laughter nearby, and Alistair flinched. It was all too much. He was a creature of the penthouse, of silent, carpeted corridors, and the filtered air of his own making. Just as he was about to demand they return to the car, a sound sliced through the din, a note so pure and clear it seemed to vibrate in his very bones. It was a melody he knew intimately, a simple, haunting folk song Alara used to hum while sketching by the window. Then came the voice, and Alistair's world stopped. His heart seized a violent, painful clench in his chest. His breath hitched. Every hair on his arm stood on end. It wasn't similar. It wasn't an echo. It was her. The timbre, the delicate vibrato, the faint, breathy lisp on the sibilants. It was Alara's voice, resurrected from the ashes of memory and brought to life in the suffocating afternoon sun. His cane clattered to the ground. His hand shot out, gripping Marcus's arm with a strength that made the stoic man grunt in surprise. "Sir?" Alistair's head whipped towards the sound, his sightless eyes wide, frantic. "That voice!" he choked out, the words tearing from his throat. "Who is that? Who is singing?" Marcus, startled by the raw, desperate panic in his employer's voice, scanned the crowd. "It's just a girl, sir. A street performer, by the looks of it. She has a little collection box." "No," Alistair breathed, shaking his head, a tremor running through his entire body. "No, you don't understand. It's her. It's my wife." The statement hung in the air, so impossible, so utterly insane, that for a moment even the unflappable Marcus was speechless. Alistair lurched forward, stumbling without his cane. "Find her," he commanded, his voice cracking with a decade of repressed grief. "Find that girl. I don't care what it takes. Bring her to me. Now!" The 10 minutes back to the armored town car were the longest of Alistair Finch's life. The frantic energy that had seized him in the park had curdled into a cold, trembling dread in the plush leather silence of the vehicle. He could still hear the voice, a perfect phantom imprint on his auditory memory, replaying the simple melody over and over. He felt Marcus slide in beside him, the subtle shift of weight, the clean, faint scent of his cologne. Beatrice got in the other side, a rustle of silk and a wave of expensive, cloying perfume that scraped at Alistair's nerves. "Alistair, what on earth was that?" she began, her voice sharp with disapproval. "You made a scene, dropping your cane, shouting like a madman. The press was there." He ignored her, his face turned towards Marcus. "Well?" The word was tight, strained. "Did you get her details? Where does she live?" There was a slight hesitation, a rustle of a notebook. "Sir, it was complicated." The girl and her mother were packing up. They seemed wary. I managed to get a name. The girl is Lily. The mother is Sarah Connolly. They live in the old warehouse district, by the docks. The docks. The name of the district conjured smells of brine and diesel, the low moan of foghorns, a world away from the sanitized air of his penthouse. And, Alistair pressed, his knuckles white where he gripped the armrest. What else? The mother was very protective, Marcus said carefully. She refused any kind of cash offer, said they weren't a charity case. I explained who you were, that it wasn't about charity, that you were just moved by her daughter's singing. Beatrice scoffed. Moved? You were having a breakdown. You thought you heard a ghost. Stay out of this, Beatrice, Alistair snapped, his voice dangerously low. He turned his face back to Marcus, the muscles in his jaw working. Give me the address, and run a background check, everything you can find on Sarah Connolly and her daughter. I want to know where she works, where the girl goes to school, what they eat for breakfast. I want to know everything. Alistair, this is madness, Beatrice interjected, her voice rising. She's a child, a street performer. You're scaring them, and you're scaring me. You haven't been like this since the accident. The word hung in the car, heavy and suffocating. The accident. The screech of tires, the impossible crumple of metal, the shattering glass, the sudden violent darkness that had stolen his sight and his wife in the same horrific instant. For a decade, he had built a fortress around that memory, a fortress of routine, silence, and solitude. Now, a little girl's voice had breached the walls and laid it all bare. It was her voice, Bea, he said, his own voice hollowed out, devoid of the earlier anger. It was exactly her voice. He didn't need to see his sister's face to know her expression would be a mixture of pity and exasperation. It's a coincidence, darling, a trick of the memory. You've been alone with her recordings for 10 years. You're projecting. He didn't argue. He couldn't explain it. The cellular certainty he felt. It wasn't a memory. It was a resurrection. He leaned his head back against the cool leather, the city flashing by outside the tinted windows, a world he could no longer see, but could suddenly, desperately feel again. The silence in the car was thick with unspoken grief and a terrifying, burgeoning hope. Hope was a dangerous thing, a fragile bird he'd locked away long ago. He was afraid if he let it out now, it would only die in the harsh light of reality. But he had to know. He had to hear that voice again, not in a crowded park, but close, where he could be sure, where he could close his eyes and pretend, just for a moment, that Elara had come back to him. The file Marcus delivered the next morning was a thin manila folder, but its contents felt as heavy as a tombstone. Alistair sat in his audio room, a space soundproofed against the city, where the only permitted sound was Elara's music. He ran his fingertips over the crisp paper as Marcus read the details aloud. Sarah Connolly, age 28, orphaned at 16, bounced around the foster system. No college degree, a string of low-wage jobs, waitress, cleaner, barista. Currently working 2 jobs, a day shift at a diner in the industrial sector and an evening shift cleaning offices downtown. 1 child, Lily, age 9. Father unknown, not listed on the birth certificate. They lived in a converted loft in a derelict warehouse, a building flagged for multiple code violations. The girl attended the local public school, where her attendance was perfect and her grades were average, except in music, where she was noted as being exceptionally gifted. Gifted. The word was inadequate. Alistair felt a knot of something complex and unsettling tighten in his gut. This wasn't a grifter, as Beatrice had immediately suggested. This was a woman struggling to survive, a woman fiercely protecting her gifted child. She has a performance permit, Marcus continued. She and the girl sing in the park on weekends. It's how they make extra money for things like shoes and winter coats, from what I can gather. The image was stark and brutal. A 9-year-old girl singing for shoes. He thought of his own climate-controlled closets, filled with rows of handmade leather shoes he couldn't even see. The chasm between their worlds was obscene. "What about the father?" Alistair asked, his voice quiet. "No trace. It's like he never existed. Sarah Connolly has no criminal record, no debts other than some outstanding medical bills from when Lily had pneumonia 2 years ago. She's clean, sir. Just poor." Alistair was silent for a long time, the hum of the high-end amplifier the only sound in the room. He pictured Sarah Connolly, a woman who had been alone since she was a teenager, fighting for her child. He pictured Lily, a little girl with a celestial voice, singing in a park for spare change. This required a different approach. Power and money, his usual tools, would only frighten them. He needed delicacy. He needed a pretext. "The Finch Foundation," he said at last. "Our annual music scholarship for underprivileged youth. When is the deadline?" Marcus was a step ahead, as always. "It closed last month, sir. The finalists have already been chosen." "Reopen it," Alistair commanded. "Create a new special discretionary grant, the Founder's Choice Award. A full scholarship to the best music academy in the city, plus a living stipend. A generous one. Draft the paperwork, and find a way to get it in front of Sarah Connolly, without letting her know it was created specifically for her daughter." Beatrice, who had entered the room silently, her soft-soled slippers making no sound on the thick rug, finally spoke. "You're creating a $100,000 grant for a child you heard singing in a park?" "I'm creating an opportunity for a gifted musician," Alistair corrected her, not turning his head. "It's what the foundation is for, is it not?" "The foundation is for helping the community, not for indulging your grief-stricken fantasies," she retorted, her voice sharp. "What happens when you get this child into a room, and you realize she's just a little girl who happens to sound like Alara? What will you do then? You'll break your own heart, Alistair, and you'll terrify this family." "I'm willing to take that risk," he said softly. "I have to." He could feel her standing behind his chair, her disapproval a palpable force. He knew she meant well. In her own severe, controlling way, she loved him. She had managed his life, his finances, and his grief for 10 years. But she couldn't understand this. To her, it was an echo. To him, it was a lifeline. He felt a faint tremor in his hands and clasped them together. For the first time in a decade, he was not just existing in his darkness. He was moving toward a light, even if it was only the phantom glow of a memory. He had to know if the light was real. The diner was an assault of smells: stale coffee, grease, and cheap disinfectant. Alistair sat in a booth in the back, the cracked vinyl sticking to his expensive trousers. It was a place he would never have set foot in before the accident, and a place he certainly had no business being in now. But Marcus's report said Sarah Connolly worked the lunch shift here, and Alistair needed to understand her world. He didn't order anything, just sat with a glass of water, a silent, imposing figure in a perfectly tailored suit, his dark glasses hiding his sightless eyes. He listened. The clatter of plates, the gruff shouts of the cook, the low murmur of conversations. And then he heard her voice, not singing, but speaking. "Here you go, hun. Extra pickles, just like you like." It was tired, frayed at the edges, but it was unmistakably the voice of an older Lily. The genetic inheritance was there in the cadence, the pitch. A waitress bustled past, and a faint scent of lavender soap and exhaustion followed in her wake. That was her, Sarah Connolly. He tracked her movements through the small space by the sound of her worn-out sneakers squeaking on the linoleum. He listened as she dealt with a rude customer, her voice remaining professional but firm. He heard her share a quiet, tired laugh with another waitress by the coffee machine. He built a picture of her from these scraps of sound, a woman who was resilient, weary, and utterly alone. He stayed for an hour, a ghost in a greasy spoon, before Marcus discreetly guided him out. He hadn't accomplished anything, not really. He hadn't spoken to her, but he had listened, and he understood. This woman would not be bought. She would not be impressed by the Finch name. She would see through any artifice. The scholarship was the only way. It had to be presented as a legitimate opportunity, an act of philanthropy, not the desperate obsession of a lonely, broken man. 2 days later, Marcus confirmed that the flyer for the new Founder's Choice grant had been posted at Lily's school and at the community center near the docks. It was a waiting game now, a quiet, agonizing torture. Alistair spent his days in the audio room, listening to Alara's recordings with a new, almost analytical intensity. He isolated her laugh from an old interview, the way she would clear her throat before starting a difficult passage. He was memorizing the blueprint of her voice so he could compare it, so he could prove to himself he wasn't mad. Beatrice watched him with a hawk's eye, her concern manifesting as criticism. "You're not eating," she'd say. "You're pacing all night. The staff can hear you. This is unhealthy, Alistair." He knew she was right, but he couldn't stop. The hope, once a fragile bird, was now a ravenous beast, demanding to be fed. A week passed, then 2. Alistair began to despair. Perhaps Sarah had seen the flyer and dismissed it as too good to be true. Perhaps she didn't want her daughter to enter the world of formal music, a world that could be cruel and demanding. He was sitting in the dark, the lonely strains of Ilara, singing a forgotten ballad filling the room, when his intercom buzzed. It was Marcus. "Sir," he said, his voice holding a carefully controlled note of something that might have been excitement. "We have an application from a Sarah Connolly on behalf of her daughter, Lily." Alistair's breath caught in his throat. He felt a dizzying wave of relief so profound it almost buckled his knees. "She applied?" "Yes, sir. Dropped it off at the Foundation office an hour ago. It's a simple form, but there's a note attached." "Read it!" Alistair ordered, his voice hoarse. Marcus cleared his throat. "To the Finch Foundation Selection Committee," he began to read. "I don't know if this is real, or if my little girl has any chance against kids who've had proper lessons their whole lives. But Lily's voice, it's a gift. The world is a hard place, but when she sings, it feels a little less hard. She deserves a chance. Thank you for considering her. Sincerely, Sarah Connolly." Alistair leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands. The simple, heartfelt words painted a clearer picture than any surveillance report. She wasn't a grifter. She was a mother, hoping for a miracle. "The auditions," Alistair said, his mind racing. "When are they?" "We can schedule them for whenever you like, sir. It's your grant." "Tomorrow," Alistair said without hesitation. "Schedule it for tomorrow, in the main recital hall. Just her. No other finalists. I don't want her to feel like she's in a competition." "And the committee?" Marcus asked. "The committee will be me," Alistair said. "Just me." He needed to hear her again. Not in a park, not on a cheap recording she might have submitted. He needed to be in the room, to feel the sound move the air around him. He needed to know if the ghost that haunted him was real. The recital hall at the Finch Foundation building was a grand, intimidating space. Acoustically perfect, paneled in dark, polished mahogany, with a stage that had been graced by some of the world's greatest musicians. For a 9-year-old girl from the docks, it must have felt like a cathedral. Alistair sat alone in the center of the auditorium, 100 feet from the stage. He wanted distance. He didn't want his presence to overwhelm her. Marcus stood discreetly by the door. The silence in the hall was absolute, a heavy, expectant void. He heard the door at the side of the stage creak open, then the soft scuff of 2 pairs of shoes, one small and hesitant, the other the weary squeak he recognized from the diner. "It's okay, sweetie," he heard a woman's voice whisper. Sarah's voice. "Just like we practiced in the park. Pretend it's just you and me." There was a shuffling sound, and he imagined Lily being gently nudged forward into the spotlight. A small throat was cleared. The sound was tiny in the vast space. "Hello?" Lily's voice was a small, timid thing. "My name is Lily Connolly. I'm 9 years old." It was a child's voice. High-pitched, a little nervous. There was nothing of Ilara in it. A cold wave of disappointment washed over Alistair. Beatrice was right. He was a fool. He had built this whole fantasy on a trick of the wind, a freak acoustic phenomenon in a noisy park. He felt a bitter, hollow ache in his chest. "What will you be singing for us today, Lily?" he asked, his voice sounding overly formal, booming in the empty hall. He heard her take a shaky breath. It's an old folk song. My mom says it's been around forever. It's called The Willow Weeps." Alistair froze. It was the same song, Alara's favorite. She had discovered it in a dusty old songbook and claimed it as her own. It was not a well-known tune. How could this child possibly know it? Lily began to sing. The first few notes were shy, uncertain. It was just a little girl, singing a cappella on a vast, empty stage. But then something shifted. As she settled into the melody, her posture must have changed. Her breath must have deepened. The timid child's voice fell away, and something else emerged. The voice. It bloomed in the perfect acoustics of the hall. Every nuance, every delicate turn of phrase, every molecule of sound identical to the voice that lived in his memory and his sound system. It was Alara. It was his Alara, young and full of hope, standing on a stage, pouring her soul into a song. The sound washed over him. In the last 10 years of darkness, silence, and grief dissolved. He wasn't a blind billionaire in an empty auditorium. He was a young man again, sitting in a smoky club, falling in love with a singer whose voice promised a world of light and beauty. Tears streamed from his useless eyes, silent, hot tracks down his face. He didn't move. He barely breathed. He just listened, letting the impossible sound rebuild his shattered world. The song ended. The final note hung in the air, a perfect, shimmering sphere of sound, before slowly fading into the profound silence. For a long moment, no one moved. Alistair could hear the frantic, rabbit-like beat of his own heart. He heard a small, shaky exhale from the stage. Then he heard Sarah Connolly's voice, a fierce, protective whisper. "That's enough. We're leaving." The squeak of her shoes, the scuff of Lily's. They were turning to go. "Wait!" Alistair called out, his voice thick with emotion. The footsteps stopped. He stood up, his legs unsteady, and took a step forward, his hand outstretched, as if he could somehow reach them across the cavernous distance. "The scholarship," he said, struggling to keep his voice even. "It's hers. The grant, the stipend, the academy, everything. It's all hers." There was another long pause. He could feel Sarah's suspicion radiating across the room. "Why?" she asked, her voice sharp, cutting through the awe that still enveloped him. "There were no other auditions. There's no committee. It's just you. Who are you?" He couldn't tell her the truth. He couldn't say, "Because your daughter has the voice of my dead wife." It was monstrous. It was insane. "I am Alistair Finch," he said, his voice regaining some of its familiar authority. "And I am the committee. I know a once-in-a-generation talent when I hear one. Your daughter has a gift, Miss Connolly. A gift my foundation was created to nurture. That is the only reason." It was a lie. A beautiful, philanthropic, well-intentioned lie. He could only pray she would believe it. He heard her take a deep breath. He imagined her looking from her small, gifted daughter to the shadowy, powerful figure in the distance. He was offering her a lifeline, a way out of the diners and the drafty lofts. But it came from the darkness, from a man she didn't know and had every reason to mistrust. The silence stretched on, and in that moment, Alistair Finch knew that all his money and all his power meant nothing. His entire world hung on the answer of a tired, wary waitress he couldn't even see. Sarah Connolly was not a fool. She had lived a life that stripped away illusions early. She knew that men like Alistair Finch, men who lived in towers and controlled empires, did not give away fortunes without a reason. And a once-in-a-generation talent felt like a line from a movie, not a genuine explanation. Yet, she couldn't deny the opportunity. The Northwood Music Academy was the best in the state, a place she could only ever have dreamed of for Lily. The stipend alone was more than she made in a year of back-breaking work. It meant no more choosing between new shoes and medicine. It meant a safe apartment, decent food, a future. Her protective instincts were at war with her maternal desperation. She looked at Lily, who was staring out at the lone figure in the auditorium, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. Lily hadn't sung for the man. She had sung for the room, for the way her voice soared and echoed back at her. She was too young to understand the complexities of patronage. "There would be conditions, I assume," Sarah said, her voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside her. Alistair seemed to understand he was being negotiated with, and a measure of his composure returned. "A few," he replied, his tone now that of a businessman. "Lily would be expected to maintain her grades. She would attend all her classes at the academy. And I would require a private recital, once a month, to personally assess her progress." The last condition sent a chill down Sarah's spine. It was personal. That was the catch. He didn't just want to fund the talent. He wanted access to it. He wanted to be near her daughter, near her voice. "Why?" she asked again, more pointedly this time. Why the personal assessment? Alistair was silent for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was different, softer, almost vulnerable. My late wife was a singer, he said simply. Music was our life. Since I lost my sight, it's the only connection I have left to that world, to beauty. Hearing your daughter's raw talent and helping it develop would be, for me, a great personal joy. It is a selfish request, I admit, but it is my only one. The explanation was disarming in its honesty. It reframed him from a powerful, mysterious predator into a lonely, blind man seeking solace in music. It was a story Sarah could almost believe. It was a story that made her pity him, and that was far more dangerous than fearing him. She looked at Lily again. Her daughter, who had no one in the world but her, who deserved every chance. How could she say no? One recital a month, Sarah agreed, her voice tight. Here, in this hall, and I will be present at every single one. That is perfectly acceptable, Alistair said. The relief in his voice was palpable. My assistant will be in touch to handle all the arrangements, the enrollment, finding you a new place to live, everything. And just like that, their lives were irrevocably changed. The transition was a whirlwind. Within a week, they were moved out of the cold, drafty loft and into a clean, modern two-bedroom apartment in a safe, quiet neighborhood. The apartment was fully furnished, the pantry stocked. For the first time in Lily's life, she had her own room. Sarah quit her night job, then her day job. The first stipend payment that appeared in her new bank account was so large she cried. It was a fairy tale. And Sarah kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the handsome prince to reveal himself as a monster. Lily, however, blossomed. At the Northwood Academy, she was no longer the odd girl from the docks, but a prodigy. She was given a vocal coach, a gentle, elderly woman named Mrs. Dubois, who looked at Lily with the reverence of a true believer. Lily learned to read music, to understand theory, to control her breathing. Her natural gift was being polished, and the results were breathtaking. The first monthly recital was a strange, formal affair. Sarah and Lily stood on the brightly lit stage, and Alistair sat in his customary seat in the dark, a solitary island of shadow. Lily, now more confident, sang a piece by Schubert she had been working on. Her voice, refined and trained, was even more of a phenomenon. Sarah watched Alistair. He didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. He just sat, his head tilted slightly, as if catching every note. When Lily finished, there was a long silence before he clapped, a slow, deliberate sound that echoed in the hall. "Excellent," he said, his voice resonating from the darkness. "Your control has improved remarkably, Lily. Mrs. Dubois is a fine teacher." He spoke to Lily directly, but Sarah felt his words were a performance for her benefit, a way of maintaining the fiction that this was all about musical progress. After the recital, as they were leaving, Marcus stopped them. "Mr. Finch would like to know if you would join him for dinner next week, a celebration of Lily's progress." Sarah's first instinct was to say no. The recitals were part of the deal. Dinners were not. But she looked at the man speaking, Marcus, always polite, always professional, and realized he was just a messenger. The request came from a man who could take all of this away as easily as he had given it. We can't," she stammered. "It's too much." "He will send a car," Marcus said, as if that solved everything. "He simply wants to thank you both properly." Sarah felt trapped. To refuse would be ungrateful and potentially disastrous. To accept felt like stepping deeper into the web. She looked at Lily, whose eyes were shining at the thought of a fancy dinner. "Okay," Sarah said, the word tasting like surrender. "We'll go." The dinner was at his penthouse. The private elevator opened directly into a space so vast and opulent it seemed more like a museum than a home. The ceilings were 20 feet high, the windows a wall of glass overlooking the glittering city lights. The art on the walls, Sarah vaguely recognized from magazines, was worth more than she could earn in 1,000 lifetimes. It was all designed to impress, to intimidate. And it worked. Alistair was waiting for them, standing by the window, his back to them. He was dressed in a simple black cashmere sweater and dark trousers, looking less like a tycoon and more like the lonely man he'd claimed to be. "Welcome," he said, turning. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "I'm glad you could come." Dinner was served by a silent, efficient housekeeper. The food was exquisite, but Sarah could barely taste it. She was too busy watching the strange, careful dance between Alistair and Lily. He couldn't see her, but he seemed to track her every movement by sound. When Lily dropped her fork, he knew exactly where it had landed. He asked her about her classes, about her favorite composers, his questions showing a deep, genuine knowledge of music. Lily, unburdened by her mother's suspicion, chattered away happily, describing her teacher, her new friends, the joy of learning a new song. Sarah watched, feeling like an outsider. This man, this blind billionaire, was connecting with her daughter in a way she couldn't. He spoke her language, the language of music. After dinner, Alistair turned his attention to Sarah. "Lily tells me you used to sing to her when she was a baby," he said, his tone casual. "I did," Sarah said, surprised. "Just lullabies. Nothing special." "Which ones?" he pressed gently. "Oh, you know, the usual." "Hush, little baby. Twinkle, twinkle." She hesitated. "There was one other, an old song my own mother supposedly sang to me, though I don't remember her. One of the nurses at the orphanage taught it to me. The willow weeps." The air in the room grew still. Alistair's faint smile vanished. His face became a blank mask. Sarah felt a sudden, prickling unease. She had said something wrong. "The willow weeps?" he repeated, his voice carefully neutral. "That's an unusual lullaby." "I guess," Sarah said, trying to sound nonchalant. "It has a soothing melody. It always helped her sleep." Alistair said nothing. He simply sat there, a marble statue in the dim light of his luxurious prison. Sarah could feel 1,000 questions hanging in the air, questions he wasn't asking, questions she was suddenly terrified to answer. She looked at her daughter, happily eating a slice of chocolate cake, oblivious to the tension that had just descended upon the room. And Sarah knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this was not about patronage. It was not about solace. It was about that song. It was about a connection she didn't understand, a secret that lay buried in the past, a secret that had everything to do with her daughter's voice and a dead woman named Alara. The monthly recitals continued. The seasons changed. Autumn's chill gave way to the deep cold of winter. Lily's voice grew stronger, richer, more expressive. The bond between her and Alistair also deepened, settling into a comfortable, almost familial rhythm. He would sit in the darkness and listen, and afterwards, in the car ride back to their apartment, Lily would excitedly recount the single, insightful compliment he'd given her. "He said I found the blue note in the Gershwin piece, Mama. Mrs. Dubois said he has perfect pitch." Sarah would smile and nod, but a knot of anxiety was perpetually tightened in her stomach. She felt herself becoming a spectator in her own daughter's life. Alistair was not just a benefactor. He was a mentor, a confidant. He sent Lily books on musical history, rare recordings, a state-of-the-art metronome. Each gift was thoughtful, appropriate, and yet each one felt like another brick in the wall he was building around her daughter. The man himself remained an enigma. He was always polite, always a gentleman, but there was a profound sadness about him, a gravitational pull of grief that seemed to warp the very air around him. Sarah started doing her own research. In the quiet hours after Lily was asleep, she would sit at her laptop, a gift from the foundation, and fall down the rabbit hole of the Finch family. She read about the accident, a tragic story of a drunk driver running a red light. She found pictures of Alara Finch. She was beautiful, with a cascade of dark hair and a wide, luminous smile. She was a rising star in the city's music scene before she married the reclusive heir to the Finch fortune. Sarah found old reviews of her performances, praising her hauntingly beautiful and one-of-a-kind voice. But there was little about her early life. The official narrative was that she was a gifted orphan who had pulled herself up by her bootstraps. It was a story remarkably similar to her own. One night, Sarah found a fan-made website, a digital shrine to Alara Finch, filled with bootleg concert recordings and grainy interviews. She clicked on a video, a local television spot from over a decade ago. Alara was being interviewed about an upcoming charity concert. She laughed, and Sarah's blood ran cold. It wasn't just the singing voice, it was the laugh. The way it started deep in her chest and bubbled up. It was Lily's laugh. Sarah slammed the laptop shut, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was beyond coincidence. It was a genetic carbon copy. How was it possible? Her own history was a blank page. She was a foundling, left at a hospital with a note that only gave her first name: Sarah. Her parents were a mystery she had long ago accepted she would never solve. But now that mystery felt sinister. The questions were relentless. Could there be a connection? Was it possible that Alara Finch, the beautiful, celebrated wife of a billionaire, was tied to her own forgotten past? The thought was so audacious, so insane, that she tried to dismiss it. But it took root, a seed of doubt that began to sprout in the fertile ground of her anxiety. She started testing the waters, subtly, during the brief, formal conversations she had with Alistair after the recitals. Alara was an orphan, wasn't she? She asked one afternoon, trying to sound casual. Alistair, who had been complimenting Lily's phrasing, went very still. "Yes," he said, his voice flat. "Her parents died when she was young." "It must have been hard for her," Sarah pushed gently, "being alone like that." "Alara was the strongest person I ever knew," he said, and the finality in his tone shut down the conversation. He did not want to talk about his wife's past. Sarah's suspicions only grew. He was hiding something. Or perhaps there was something he didn't know. The breaking point came in the spring. Lily was preparing for the Academy's spring showcase, and Alistair had arranged for a world-renowned dressmaker to create a custom gown for her performance. It was an extravagant, unnecessary gesture that made Sarah deeply uncomfortable. While Lily was being fitted in their apartment, the dressmaker, a kind, elderly Frenchwoman, hummed a tune as she worked. It was a French lullaby, soft and sweet. Lily, without thinking, began to hum along, then started singing the words in perfect, unaccented French. The dressmaker stopped, her hands hovering over a pincushion. "Oh, you know this song?" she asked, delighted. I think so," Lily said, looking confused. "I don't know how I know it." Sarah's heart stopped. She had never heard that lullaby in her life. She had never sung it to Lily. There was no way her daughter could know it. "Where did you hear that, sweetie?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know, Mama," Lily said, her brow furrowed. "It's just, in my head, like the willow weeps." "My grandmother used to sing this to me," the dressmaker said, her eyes misty with memory. "It is not a common song." After the woman left, Sarah sat Lily down. "Honey, I need you to be very honest with me. Has Mr. Finch ever played you old recordings? Or has Mrs. Dubois?" "No, Mama," Lily said, shaking her head. "Just the music for my lessons." Sarah felt a terrifying clarity descend upon her. It wasn't a learned thing. It was innate. The voice, the laugh, the song she had no business knowing. It was some kind of genetic memory, an inheritance passed down in blood and bone. And there was only one person who could give her the answers she needed. Not Alistair, not his sister, the formidable Beatrice, who always looked at Sarah with thinly veiled contempt. She needed to find someone who knew Ilara before she was a Finch. A friend, a former bandmate, anyone. Her search led her to a man named Ben, a grizzled, cynical jazz pianist who played in a dive bar on the other side of town. He was listed as the keyboardist on one of Ilara's early independent EPs. It took Sarah a week to get up the nerve to go, and another hour of sitting in the dark, smoky bar before she approached him between sets. He was wary, his eyes narrowed when she mentioned Ilara's name. "Yeah, I knew her. A long time ago. Before she hit the jackpot," he said, wiping down the keys with a rag. "Why?" "I need to ask you about her," Sarah said, sliding a $20 bill onto the piano. "About her life before Alistair Finch." Ben looked at the money, then at her face. He sighed, a plume of weary smoke. "What do you want to know?" "Did she ever mention having a child?" Sarah asked, the question coming out in a rush. Ben froze. He stared at her, really looked at her, his eyes tracing the lines of her face. A slow, dawning recognition spread across his features. "Good God!" he whispered, his cynical facade crumbling. "I'll be damned. She did it. She really did it." "Did what?" Sarah pressed, her hands shaking. "What did she do?" Ben leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "Ilara got pregnant when she was 17. We were just kids, trying to make it. Broke as hell. The father was a musician, a real piece of work. He took off the second she told him. She was terrified. Her family, the little she had, they were zealots. They would have disowned her. She had the baby, a little girl, and she gave her up. A closed adoption. She said it was the only way to give her daughter a chance at a real life. She made me swear I'd never tell anyone." Sarah felt the floor drop out from under her. The noise of the bar faded to a dull roar. The pieces of her life, the jagged, disconnected shards of an unknown past, suddenly slammed together into a coherent, earth-shattering picture. The orphanage, the voice, the songs. Ilara Finch was not just some woman her daughter sounded like. She was her mother. And Lily, her beautiful, gifted Lily, was Alistair Finch's wife's granddaughter. The man who had taken them in, who was obsessed with her daughter's voice, had no idea that the ghost he was chasing was standing right in front of him, in the form of his wife's own bloodline. The fairy tale had just become a Greek tragedy, and she and Lily were standing at its epicenter. The walk home from the bar was a blur. The city lights smeared together, the sounds of traffic distant and muted. Sarah's mind was a maelstrom of shock, grief, and a terrifying, clarifying anger. Her mother had given her away. The thought was a raw, open wound. All her life, she had been a question mark, a story without a beginning. Now she had one, and it was a story of abandonment. But tangled with the pain was a fierce, protective love for the woman she had never known. Alara had been 17, alone and scared. She had made an impossible choice, believing it was for the best. Sarah, who had fought tooth and nail to keep Lily, understood that desperation. And then there was Alistair. His obsession was no longer a mystery. It was a cosmic irony. He was mourning his wife while her legacy was living under his roof, singing her songs back to him. Did he deserve to know? Her first instinct was to run, to take Lily and disappear, to escape the suffocating gravity of the Finch family and their tragic history. But where would they go? Back to the drafty loft, the greasy spoon diners, the weekends singing for spare change? Alistair had given Lily a future. Could she, in good conscience, steal it away from her? And what about Lily? She was thriving. She loved her school, her teacher, her music. She had even grown fond of the sad, kind man who listened to her sing with such rapt attention. To rip her away from all that would be cruel. No, running wasn't the answer. Confrontation was. But how, walking up to a reclusive, blind billionaire and telling him his dead wife had a secret child, and that he was now the benefactor to her secret grandchild, was not a simple conversation. She needed proof, something more than the word of a cynical jazz pianist. The next day, she called the bar and got Ben's number. He was reluctant to get more involved, but Sarah was persuasive. She wasn't after money. She was after the truth. He eventually admitted that Alara had given him a small box for safekeeping before she married Alistair. She said if anything ever happened to her, and if a girl with her eyes ever came looking, I was to give her this, Ben confessed. I never knew what she meant. I stuck it in a storage unit and forgot about it until you showed up. The storage unit was across town, a grimy, forgotten place. The box was small, made of cedar wood, and tied with a faded ribbon. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed velvet, were a handful of items. A photograph of a breathtakingly young Alara, holding a swaddled infant. On the back, in faded ink, it said, "My Sarah, forgive me." There was a birth certificate listing Alara's name as the mother and the father's as unknown. And there was a stack of letters addressed to my dearest daughter, written over the years. They were a torrent of love, regret, and hope. Alara had followed Sarah's life from a distance, through the sterile reports of the adoption agency. She knew about the foster homes, the struggles. She wrote of her own success, her marriage to a good, kind man named Alistair, and her constant aching guilt. The last letter was dated just a week before the accident. I hope one day you find this, Alara had written, and I hope you can understand. I have never stopped loving you. I hear you in every song I sing. Your life is my secret melody. Sarah sat on the dusty floor of the storage unit and wept. She wept for the mother she never knew, for the lonely girl she had been, and for the incredible, tragic story that was her inheritance. Now she had proof. Now she had to face Alistair. But when she thought of it, it wasn't Alistair she feared. It was his sister, Beatrice. Beatrice, who managed the Finch empire with an iron fist. Beatrice, whose hostility toward Sarah had been clear from the start. Beatrice would see this not as a family reunion, but as an attack, a brazen attempt to lay claim to the Finch fortune. She would try to destroy them. The spring showcase was in 3 days. Lily was scheduled to sing the final headline solo. The entire city's arts community would be there. Alistair would be in the front row. It was the perfect stage, not just for Lily's debut, but for the truth to finally be heard. It was a terrifying, audacious plan. But Sarah knew she had no other choice. She couldn't live in the shadow of this secret any longer. She owed it to her mother, to her daughter, and to herself. On the night of the showcase, the auditorium was buzzing. The air was thick with perfume and quiet ambition. Sarah stood backstage with Lily, smoothing down the silk of her beautiful gown. Lily was a ball of nerves and excitement, bouncing on the balls of her feet. "Are you nervous, Mama?" Lily asked, looking up at her. "A little," Sarah admitted, which was the understatement of the century. Her heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of her chest. She had the cedar box in her oversized handbag. Her plan was simple and probably insane. After Lily's performance, during the applause, she would walk to the front of the stage. She would ask Mr. Finch to join her, and then, in front of everyone, she would tell the story. It was the only way to neutralize Beatrice. A public revelation would be a scandal, but it would be one the Finches couldn't bury. They would have to acknowledge it. Lily was called to the stage. She walked into the spotlight, a tiny, elegant figure in a sea of darkness. She gave a small, nervous bow. Then she looked towards the front row, found the place where she knew Alistair was sitting, and smiled. The accompanist began the introduction. The song Lily had chosen, with Mrs. Dubois' encouragement, was "The Willow Weeps." Sarah's breath caught. It was the song that had started everything. Lily began to sing. Her voice, confident and pure, filled the massive hall. The audience was transfixed, utterly silent. This was no mere student performance. It was the arrival of a major talent. But Sarah wasn't just hearing a beautiful voice. She was hearing a legacy. She heard her mother's voice, a ghost from the past, entwined with her daughter's, a promise for the future. As the final, haunting note faded, the auditorium remained silent for a heartbeat, and then erupted into thunderous applause. People were rising to their feet. This was it. This was her moment. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Sarah clutched her handbag and stepped out from the wings, walking towards the center of the stage where her daughter was taking a bow, her face flushed with triumph. She saw Alistair in the front row, clapping, a rare, genuine smile on his face. She saw Beatrice next to him, her expression one of grudging pride. Sarah's steps faltered. Could she really do this? Could she shatter this one moment of pure joy for them, for her daughter? As she hesitated, Beatrice's eyes found hers. The woman's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold fury. Beatrice knew. Somehow she knew that Sarah was about to do something to disrupt their carefully controlled world. In that moment, Sarah's resolve hardened. This wasn't just for her. It was against everything Beatrice represented. The power, the secrets, the cold, hard money that had kept her mother from her. She took another step forward, opening her mouth to speak. But before she could say a word, a commotion started at the side of the auditorium. Two uniformed police officers were walking down the aisle, heading directly for the stage. They were being led by Beatrice Finch's personal security guard. They stopped at the front row. One of them leaned down and spoke to Beatrice, who nodded grimly. Then the officer turned, pointed a finger directly at Sarah, and spoke, his voice amplified by the still live stage microphone. "Sarah Connolly!" His voice boomed through the hall. "You're under arrest for fraud and extortion." The applause died instantly. A collective gasp swept through the audience. Lily's face crumpled in confusion and fear, and she ran to Sarah's side. The world tilted on its axis. Beatrice had struck first. She had twisted the narrative, painting Sarah not as a long-lost heir, but as a criminal. Sarah stood frozen in the spotlight, the cedar box feeling as heavy as an anchor, her daughter trembling beside her, as her entire world came crashing down. The chaos that erupted in the auditorium was a nightmare of flashing lights and shouted questions. Ushers were trying to control the crowd. Reporters were surging forward. And through it all, Sarah could only see Alistair's face. He was on his feet, his head turning back and forth between the stage and his sister, his expression one of utter shock and confusion. "Beatrice, what is this?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the noise. "What have you done?" "I've done what you were too blind and sentimental to do, Alistair." Beatrice's voice was cold, ringing with triumph. "I've stopped a grifter from destroying our family. I've been having her investigated for months. She manufactured this entire story, this connection to Alara. She's a con artist who has been extorting you for a year." Lily was sobbing now, clinging to Sarah's leg. The police officers were on the stage, their faces grim. "Ma'am, you need to come with us," one of them said, reaching for her arm. Sarah's mind, which had been frozen in shock, suddenly rebooted with a surge of pure adrenaline. This was not how her story would end. She would not be dragged away in disgrace, her daughter's future ruined, her mother's memory slandered. "No," Sarah said, her voice shaking but loud enough to be heard. She pulled away from the officer's grasp. She looked past the police, past the stunned audience, and directly at Alistair. "She's lying, Alistair. She's afraid of the truth. The truth is, you're a fraud," Beatrice shrieked. Sarah ignored her. She knelt down, holding the cedar box. "Alistair, your wife, Alara, she had a secret. A child she gave up for adoption when she was 17. A daughter. I have the proof right here. Letters, a birth certificate, a photograph." She fumbled with the clasp, her hands trembling too much to open it. Alistair took a step toward the stage, his hand outstretched, guided only by the sound of her voice. Marcus was at his side, trying to hold him back, but Alistair shook him off. "Let me see," he commanded, his voice raw with a terrible, desperate hope. "Read them to me." "Don't listen to her, Alistair," Beatrice cried, her composure finally cracking. "It's all forged. It's a trick." Sarah finally got the box open. She pulled out the photograph of the young Alara holding the baby. She held it out. "Describe this to him, Marcus," she pleaded, her eyes finding the stoic security man. "You worked for him when Alara was alive. You knew her. Describe what you see." Marcus hesitated, looking at Beatrice, then at his distraught employer. His loyalty was being torn in two, but he was a man of integrity. He stepped forward, took the photograph from Sarah's shaking hand, and looked at it. His professional mask crumbled. "Sir," he said, his voice thick with emotion, It's Mrs. Finch, from when she was younger, much younger, and she's holding a baby." Alistair let out a sound, a guttural cry of pain and disbelief. He stumbled forward, climbing the steps to the stage, his hands searching in the darkness. "The letters!" he choked out. "Read the letters." Sarah picked up the topmost letter, the one dated just before the accident. Her voice shook as she began to read Ilara's words, her final message to the daughter she never knew. "My dearest daughter, if you are reading this, it means the world has shifted in some way I cannot predict. I live a life of incredible privilege now, with a man I love more than words can say. Alistair is kind and good, and he does not know about you. This is my greatest shame and my deepest regret. I was a child when I had you, and I made a choice I thought was brave. But now I know it was born of fear. I have never stopped loving you. I hear you in every song I sing. Your life is my secret melody." Sarah's voice broke on the last line. Lily was openly weeping beside her. In the auditorium, a profound, stunned silence had fallen. The only sound was the rustle of clothing and the distant wail of a siren. Alistair had found his way to Sarah. He stood before her, his sightless eyes overflowing with tears. He reached out, his trembling hands finding her arms, then her face, his fingertips tracing her features, as if trying to read a story written in Braille. "Ilara, she never told me," he whispered, his voice shattered. "All these years, she carried this alone." He then knelt down, his hands finding Lily, who shrank back at first before his touch, so full of anguish and tenderness, calmed her. He gently wiped a tear from her cheek. "And you," he breathed. "Your voice. It wasn't an echo. It was a legacy." The truth was out, laid bare in the harshest of spotlights. It was undeniable, written in a dead woman's hand and sung in her grandchild's voice. Beatrice stood frozen by the side of the stage, her face pale, her triumphant smirk replaced by a mask of horror. She had not just miscalculated, she had committed an act of unimaginable cruelty in the name of protecting a lie. The police officers looked confused, exchanging glances. The fraud charges were evaporating in the face of this raw, emotional truth. One of them spoke into his radio, his voice low. Sarah looked from the broken man kneeling before her daughter to the defeated woman who had tried to ruin them. There was no triumph in this moment, only a vast aching sadness for all the years lost, the secrets kept, the pain endured. The show was over. The real story was just beginning. In the aftermath, the world outside the Finch penthouse swirled with scandal and speculation. But inside, a fragile, somber peace began to take hold. The charges against Sarah were dropped before she ever saw a precinct. Beatrice, in a move that shocked everyone, especially Alistair, gave a full confession to the district attorney. She admitted to leveraging Finch corporate investigators to build a fraudulent case against Sarah, to intimidating witnesses, to conspiring with a corrupt police captain. She had attempted to frame an innocent woman to protect what she saw as her family's legacy, and more importantly, her brother's fragile sanity. She was charged with a litany of crimes, her downfall as swift and public as her attack on Sarah had been. Alistair did not intervene. He let the law run its course. His sister's betrayal, a wound almost as deep as the one Ilara's secret had left. He, Sarah, and Lily retreated into the quiet solitude of the penthouse. The first few days were a blur of tears and quiet conversation. Alistair had Sarah read all of Alara's letters to him, one by one. He would sit in his usual chair, his head in his hands, as Sarah's voice gave life to his wife's deepest regrets and most profound love. It was an agonizing, intimate process of discovery. He learned of the life Alara had lived before him, the poverty and fear that had led to her impossible choice. He was not angry at her for the secret. He was heartbroken that she had felt she had to carry it alone. He mourned not just for his wife, but for the daughter she never got to know, and the years of fatherhood Sarah had been denied. For Sarah, the process was one of connection. In her own letters and Alistair's shared memories, her mother became a real, flawed, beautiful person. She was no longer a ghost or a fantasy, but a woman of strength and sorrow. And in Alistair, she found an unexpected ally. He didn't treat her as an intruder or a claimant to a fortune. He treated her as family, as the last living piece of the woman they had both loved. The dynamic with Lily was the most natural. For Alistair, looking at, or rather listening to, Lily was no longer about chasing a ghost. It was about seeing the future. He heard Alara's voice, yes, but he also heard Lily's spirit, her resilience, her unique, bright personality. He began to teach her himself, sitting with her at the grand piano, his long, graceful fingers guiding hers on the keys, explaining music theory, not through sight, but through feeling and sound. He was not just her benefactor anymore. He was her grandfather. Sarah watched this new, strange family take shape. She saw the profound sadness in Alistair begin to recede, replaced by a quiet, paternal affection. She saw Lily, who had only ever known a life with a single, struggling parent, blossom under the attention and stability. One afternoon, while Lily was at the academy, Alistair asked Sarah to join him in the audio room. He didn't play any of Alara's music. They just sat in the soundproofed silence. "Beatrice's trial is next month," he said, breaking the quiet. "She has pleaded guilty to all charges. Her lawyers say she'll likely serve time." Sarah didn't know what to say. There was no joy in her adversary's fall. "I'm sorry," she offered quietly. "She is my sister," Alistair said, a deep sigh shuddering through him. "I believe, in her own twisted way, she thought she was protecting me, protecting Alara's memory. She saw you and Lily as a threat to that memory. She couldn't see that you were its continuation." He turned his face towards her, his sightless eyes seeming to look right through her. "The Finch Foundation is, by rights, as much yours and Lily's as it is mine. Alara's legacy is in both her music and her bloodline. I am changing my will. Everything will be split between the three of us." Sarah was stunned. "Alistair, no. We don't want your money. We never did." "This isn't about money," he said firmly. "It's about justice. It's about family. Alara made a choice born of poverty. I want to ensure that her daughter and her granddaughter never have to make a choice like that again. Please, allow me to do this. For her." Seeing the deep, pleading sincerity in his face, she could only nod. The world would see it as a gold digger's victory. They would never understand the strange, sad, beautiful truth of their intertwined lives. A few months later, on a bright, sunny afternoon, the three of them stood in a small, private cemetery overlooking the ocean. It was the first time Alistair had visited Alara's grave since the funeral 10 years ago. He ran his fingers over the etched letters of her name, the cold stone, a final, physical connection. Sarah stood beside him, her hand on his arm, a quiet pillar of support. Lily held his other hand. She had brought her violin from the academy. After a long, quiet moment, Lily raised the instrument to her chin. She didn't play one of Alara's songs, or a somber piece by a long-dead composer. She played a simple, original melody. It was a song of her own making, hesitant at first, then growing in confidence. It was a sound that was not about the past, but about the future. It was a melody full of hope. Alistair listened, the ocean breeze on his face, tears streaming silently from his eyes. But for the first time in a decade, they were not tears of grief. They were tears of gratitude. He had lost his sight, but he could finally see. He saw a future filled with music. He saw a daughter he never knew he had. He saw a granddaughter who was the living, breathing embodiment of the love he thought he had lost forever. He had spent 10 years living in a silent, dark room, listening to echoes. Now his world was filled with life, with love, with a new and beautiful song. And for the first time, it was enough. The blind billionaire was no longer blind. He could finally see what mattered.